Hi. For those of you who can't see me and those of you who can, my name is Bill Kartalopoulos. I'm extremely honored to be here today with two of the greatest living cartoonists in the world. I'm the series editor for the Best American Comics series. I'm also the programming director for this here MoCA Festival. And it's my great privilege to be here tonight. Thank you. And it's my great privilege for me to be here with two artists who need no introduction. Please join me in welcoming Art Spiegelman and Joost Swarte. So I titled this panel Drinking Ink, which maybe sounds cute even if you have no idea what the context is. It seems maybe arbitrary, but this was actually a response to a very specific anecdote that I read in an interview that Joost gave to the Comics Journal several years ago. And this concerns the very first time that Art Spiegelman met Joost Swarte. Joost, can you tell us where this was and what the circumstances were?
Well, yes, that was in Amsterdam when Art and Françoise made a trip to Europe. And Françoise did like to introduce Art to European comics.
No, vice versa.
Vice versa. And at a certain moment, Art phoned me and said, cannot we meet somewhere? And I said, yeah, maybe in a journalist cafe in Amsterdam called Scheltema. And at a certain time, I came there, and at the table sat Art Spiegelman with 2 pots of inks ready to drink, and because he just finished his breakdowns book, Drinking Ink, and he drinks it like, not like wine, like beer, where I am more nipping like gin.
So we had an ink toast when we
Yes, we
met.
did. Yeah.
We had done this not knowing that the other had done it at a similar enough. Is this better if I aim it at me? Oh, yes. So we had each done this without knowing the other was working on a picture of imbibing the same substance. But Joost and I had some contact prior to this. When I was at Arcade, there was some contact back and forth between us. Finally, I was in Europe, and at that point, Amsterdam was the crossroads of European comics in a way, because the Dutch, they read French, they read German, they read Swahili, they speak English better than we do. And the comic shops, such as they were, really reflected that. The only thing I didn't find in the main shop then, which was Real Free Press, I had a store where they sold basically dope and comics. He got busted for the dope rather than the comics. And anyway, it was where I discovered a lot of the material that Françoise and I drank in and became a core of Raw Magazine. So Mariscal, first time we saw his work, work that I was aware of but hadn't seen much of, like Joost and Eddie Vermeulen, and many of the other people were all on this one trip to Europe where all of a sudden it seemed that the avant-garde of comic art had switched from San Francisco to all over Europe, where it had taken the seeds had traveled. There was a floating kind of poker game that had landed in Europe, and a new avant-garde comic scene had developed.
I'd like to talk a little bit about that period specifically. We will look at some more recent images, but I'm hoping everyone will bear with me because I'm very interested in exactly what you were just talking about. I think, like in America, we know the history of American underground comics very well. We can sort of recite it very easily, that it started with these underground newspapers, and you had these cartoonists who were kind of the right age to have remembered having their EC comics taken away at the time that the counterculture was blossoming, and then Crumb sort of established the standard comic book format as the format, and lots of people followed in his footsteps, producing work for that format. And we know this history very well. We don't know as well the European side of that. And also what's really fascinating to me is the way that the American and the various European underground scenes all kind of intermingled and communicated with one another. I have a couple of relevant images here. I mean, and these are some covers of underground publications that you contributed work to, Art, and the work that you, the comics that you contributed to in this kind of period from like 68 to 76, they tended to be anthologies, either anthologies edited by other people or anthologies that you edited yourself. You didn't have like a title like Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers or something like that, but you engineered platforms for yourself that included work by other people as well as your own work. Why did that work better for you than having you know, the equivalent of like the Freak Brothers or some series like that?
Well, I've always been among the least prolific cartoonists I know. And if I did a solo book, it would be a 4-page book every year. One of my inspirations, of course, was Harvey Kurtzman, who I ended up taking him as a role model. He was an editor as well as an artist, created Mad Comics, for anybody who might not know. It seemed as interesting to be kind of making and designing and organizing material as it was to produce it. And I guess the reason that I wasn't more prolific is it was hard enough to even draw badly as a beginning underground cartoonist. So that slowed me down. I learned a lot, like you passed a cover called Real Pulp. There's a cartoonist who's sort of a renegade from the real world of comics, which now seems to me like the surreal world of comics, the Marvel DC universe, who had been working professionally and then just was a strange enough character to drift out to California. Roger Brand, who did the cover of that book. And he had worked with a lot of the Gil Kane as an assistant of Gil Kane's, and with Wally Wood. And so he really knew how it was done, and I learned a lot by hanging out with him, and thereby started doing pulpier style material in Real Pulp that I'm embarrassed by now, but was very useful in developing as a cartoonist. So it never seemed like it was about making money, so it never seemed like I should try to create a character that would become wildly popular and could be made into best-selling t-shirts or something. I was just trying to understand what comics were and learning how to do them.
I do think there also part of it is, I think some artists have this more than others, certainly some cartoonists have this more than others, this kind of voracious impulse to sort of know the entire landscape. I think some people get very comfortable finding their own niche and having their own friends. But I think, Joost, I saw you in Helsinki at a comics festival not too long ago, and you were like doing the same thing that like 20-year-old people were doing, just walking around with your kind of eyes open, like, you know, which is the good comic? What's the one that I must get and put in my suitcase and bring home with me? Like, where do you think, both of you, this impulse comes from to sort of want to know the landscape and sort of really know where things are and who's doing new things?
Well, I'm always been interested in the inventor artists. And as you mentioned, art didn't have a main character that could be, or that would be serialized or whatever, that because probably he's more a short story writer or inventing each time another form that fits with the content of what he wants to tell. And that's clear when you see Breakdowns, the book, the collection of all the different things that he did before he made Mouse. And I mean, that never stops. I was learning with other artists about the older generation of artists like Lionel Feininger, that I admire a lot, or Crazy Cat, of course, that I like a lot. But that was a series, but it was a crazy series. So the inventing of things is important, and I'd rather see the new and young artists in the field that are now inventing new things than I would get into a sort of a repetition.
How about for you, Art? I feel like you've had periods of being very actively engaged with what's happening at the moment, and other times where you sort of pull back a little bit and get a little more reflective and maybe get more into the history of the work.
Well, it's because, I mean, you know, Mouse is this giant anomaly in my life. It was one more short story that took 13 years and 300 pages because it was born of a formal idea. I just wanted to make a long comic book that needed a bookmark and wanted to be reread in book format rather than comics format. It was it's a lot longer a phrase than graphic novel, but probably more accurate. And I suppose all my life I've just been really interested in the anomalous cartoonist, the ones who invent a new way of making. And even for me, like I kind of feel that I'm basically working from an idea, then trying to become the cartoonist who can realize that idea. And that's somehow even what Mou's was, although it was a very long example of it. And I don't know, I think that that voraciousness has remained, but I will confess to you that I am the most baffled person I know right now, because it's one of those be careful what you wish for moments. It used to be that I knew who inked Kid Colt when Dick Ayers was penciling it, even though I had no interest in Westerns, no interest in Dick Ayers, no interest in those comics for a long time after my early childhood. But it was such a small field, one could know everything. And that was kind of comforting. It's one of the reasons I didn't become an art historian, is all of a sudden you're responsible for about 3,000 years of art making. Here it was easy. It was like 100 years max, you know. Duck soup. You could ace that course. And it became fascinating to me to know all of these connections, to recognize the art styles, whatever. And somehow I know that between what Françoise and I did in Raw magazine and what Mou's enabled in publishing was at the very core of a major seismic shift. Part of that is, the fruits of that shift are all around me when I go upstairs. But now I feel a little bit like Moses, who's led people to the promised land but isn't allowed to enter. I don't know what's there. It's too much. And when I talk to the people who I meet, they know their corner of it, as you said, and the publishers don't even know what the hell's going on. So, but that was ever thus. But very specifically, with the best intentions, there's too much going on. It's amazing. It's so amazing that I pick things up, I really like them, then I don't remember the name of it or the artist, and then I have to, it has, through sheer bludgeoning repetition, I go, okay, Michael DeForge, got it. But it's not obvious, it's not easy for me to keep up now, and it leaves me feeling really confused, because I know there's stuff that's crackling, that's really happening, but it's not that easy for me to like figure out where it is, because it had that kind of weird passing through the movie 2001's monolith, evolving into something that is sort of amazing to me. And, you know, right before we came in here, I'm talking with Françoise, and she's saying, but you should be really proud. There's this room, it's not in the basement of a church, and there's a lot of women here. So it's quite astounding, but I now no longer feel like an authority. Raw really was the result of a spelunking expedition to see what could be found, you know. And we went to Paris, we went to Amsterdam, after a while we went to Italy, and it was really possible. The scene was still, each scene was manageable. It's just when you put it together, you'd find a lot. What I'm proud of in Raw is finding the people that include Joost, that includes Mariscal, that includes Jack Tardy, each of whom developed later a school, not intentionally, but they found a new way to make a comic. And that to me is like the most exciting aspect of comics, is like the reinvention of what it can be. Because all you really know is it's got words, it's got pictures, it should be stupid. But if you have those three things, then you've made something new. And if you make something new, that's what we were looking for. And I'm proud that Raw actually was planting those flags before they created the schools that formed around them, because they really had found something new. And the validation is seeing all of the artists who started drawing like Joost, the people who would draw like Gary Panter, but then he was a moving target, so there'd be another generation drawing like Gary Panter, and so on.
Drawing like a different Gary Panter.
A different Gary Panter, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. I mean, I find also, you know, like I mentioned, you know, you go to Helsinki, for example, and you realize, oh, there's this whole trove of Finnish artists,
Yes.
many of whom I hadn't seen before. And it's like, even if you feel like you understand your own comics culture, then when you go abroad, you see a lot of other things happening. And it's with
And it's actually merciful not to be able to read the language. There's a lot of things I thought was great. And then somebody translated and go, oh, not as good as I thought. Okay.
Yeah. But I want to back up a little bit to that kind of the moment that sort of produced the possibility of you and Joost meeting. Joost, we know in the United States, for example, that the underground comics had something to do with the anti-Vietnam War movement, civil rights, women's rights, of course, psychedelic drugs and other kinds of changes in culture. You mentioned in an interview that I was looking at in preparation the Provos, who are a kind of almost like proto-yippie situationist type group in the Netherlands who are kind of important and inspiring to you. Can you explain what this was?
Well, it was a sort. It wasn't really a group. It wasn't really a movement, but it happened, and there was a young generation that didn't agree on the war in Vietnam, that didn't agree on the culture of their parents, and they thought we're gonna do something totally different. So they made happenings in the streets, and there was no theory behind it. I mean, some people tried to give it a theory, but I think that as soon as the theories came in, that was the finish of the end of this movement. Now, for young high schoolers like me in Holland at the time, this was really the new world. So we saw in magazines about the pop music and about Provo. It had all articles, and I was sure that I wanted to do something in life that was more expressive than what I studied for. I studied at the time industrial design, and at that time the design department focused on what we now call the Swiss design, so the functionalists. If you have Helvetica, why think of another typeface? and I love typefaces, so I thought I'd better stop this school and start my own magazine, and that's what I did.
And there was a whole there was an international cultural movement. So we see that in the Netherlands there was this kind of youth culture, just as there was in the U.S. And similarly in France, very spectacularly, there was the student protests and general strikes of May '68. And in every country, it seemed like there was a kind of political side to this and also a cultural side. And to some extent or another, that cultural side involved comics. And I think there was a lot of interchange between the French underground comics and various other international comics. My understanding is that this publication, Actuel, was probably the strongest one, publishing a lot of American comics, both underground and historical. We see Winsor McCay. Other publications in France at the time that published underground and international work included Charlie, which was a monthly. And it's really interesting to see the first 6 issues of Charlie. The first 5 have historical American artwork. And it's only by the 6th one that you get Wolinski, who's...
I think Charlie came after the Italians invented their magazine Linus, with the Peanuts in it, but also with a new generation of artists. And the French took up and changed the name Linus to Charlie.
Didn't Charlie Hebdo come before Charlie?
Yeah, Charlie Hebdo already existed, but the Charlie Mensuel, which is this monthly, that was taken from Linus, Italy. But already this exists, like you see, the policeman kisses another man, the Harakiri movement, which was quite a bizarre, anti-everything, rough.
Actually, Harakiri was founded by Fred.
What was founded by Fred? Harakiri, yeah. Avec Professeur Choron.
Yeah, and he did the first 60 covers.
Wow.
So it really is a quite
Yeah.
magazine.
Yeah.
And I think Guy Pellert was also published in Harakiri.
Oh, yeah.
Some of that work's been reprinted recently in the United States. I feel like Harakiri, I haven't seen very much of it. Almost, from what I understand of it, it seems like a maybe somewhat more sexualized version of like Harvey Kurtzman's Dream magazine, like a very kind of adult satire magazine.
Yeah, Harakiri was about the same time as an important magazine in Germany called Pardon.
Yeah.
And they had a very vague resemblance to what the National Lampoon was, sort of, but more politicized and a bit more adventurous in terms of what they would take on. Harakiri, the Hebdo, the weekly, was an amazing magazine. It got busted by the cops regularly. And then at a certain point they got shut down, so they came back, well, we'll call it Charlie. So it was Charlie Hebdo. They didn't miss a week.
My understanding is that they got shut down because they said something very insulting when Charles de Gaulle died, so they called it Charlie in honor of
When de Gaulle died, there had just been a tragedy the week before where there had been like a disco, fire in a disco. With a lot of young people dying, and the world was in news. Then de Gaulle died, and all of French media went into like calm music and funereal, and they had a cover that says ball, like disco, because it was a ball in Colombia, which is where de Gaulle was living one day.
Yeah.
Which was really hilarious. It was so irreverent that they could actually use that music. So it was not just band, it was just a complete...
Did you? I'm sorry. No, I'm glad you said. In fact, maybe you should be up there because you know. Quite seriously, Françoise, if you want, come on up because you'll be.
Or we could just pass you a wireless mic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there one? Well, okay. I know Willem became an important part. A friend of yours from your comics days. He was just the president in Angoulême.
Yes, that's right. He started at the Provo Time in that period. And in 1968 he fled the country, maybe 1967, and started to live in Paris. And he published in Harakiri, and from the beginning on he had quite a success. He made comics, he made political cartoons, etc. And he's still going strong. He's now the daily cartoonist for the journal Libération.
And there are a few important Dutch underground publications that I'm aware of. My understanding is that the most active one that published the most issues was this one, Tintin and Presenteert.
Yes.
I'm probably pronouncing it badly.
No, that's okay.
Okay, but anyway, this was my understanding. This was kind of almost like the Zap of Dutch underground comics in a way.
Yeah, you can say so.
And this is the first issue, and there's a real, I haven't seen many issues of this, but just looking at the covers, which you can find if you look around, there's a real stylistic diversity that one sees, as well also something I think that you don't see so much in the American undergrounds, which is this kind of influence of the Franco-Belgian tradition on the underground comics.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, and this is actually the issue that you drew a cover for here in 1974 with a full-color back cover as well. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what this was, this Tintin and Presenteert?
Well, it was quite an important magazine. It was a magazine of, it was mere a group of friends that discovered a lot about comics. And from time to time we came together, and each of the artists brought along an important book that they just gotten somewhere. American comics or very old thing, and I remember there was at Evert Gerard's house, who was the founder of the magazine. He had a book of Albert Herter, and Albert Herter was the one that invented all the toys and the clocks and the ceramics in the film Pinocchio from Disney. And there was a whole book dedicated to him. So it was really, each time when I went there, I came home with new ideas and with new possibilities. So it was quite an important magazine. Now the print run wasn't that big. It was only, I think it was about 2,000, maybe in the heyday it was about maybe 3 at the highest, and then sold 2, but that must be about it. But it had an enormous influence on each artist, because when you see the first issue of the magazine and you see the last one, there is a great development in styles of the different artists. And what I liked so much is that each one didn't want to persuade the other artist that a certain style would be the best style to make comics in. We respected each other's styles and respected the fact that we were all individual artists.
And you were contributing to this magazine, obviously, as we see here. At the same time, I understand that you were also editing your own publication.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about this and why it was also important to you to go to all the work to make your own publication rather than just contribute to the others?
When I quit school, when I quit the design school, I thought now I'm a professional comic artist, and there was a magazine, an underground magazine in the city that I lived at the time, Eindhoven, in the south of the country, and I could publish 1 or 2 pages each month there, but my production was far higher. So what do? You start a magazine, and it lasted about 10 issues. But it was less it was influenced on the content. The freedom was influenced by the American underground, but the size of the magazines, how we started it, had more to do with the local underground press at the time.
Speaking about the underground press, I got to talk about harakiri because it's something that's like urgently needed even now in the world. You know, like I wish Occupy had the equivalent of harakiri. It was a week's columns, writings, and drawings and photos in a kind of underground newspaper format. It was strictly provocative and satirical, and it was very spontaneous. When it became Charlie Hebdo, at some point, Françoise and I were invited to one of their weekly banquets. The weekly banquet was a really long table, almost the length of this room. All of the artists connected to harakiri would get 12 sheets to the wind with the wine that was just working its way up and down the table. There were giant piles of Xerox-type paper and Sharpies. And in the course of the dinner, everybody would be doing a rather crude drawing, like not any different than this one, let's say, but it was their take on the week's news, done as a very, very fast drawing for the idea. It came up with a kind of thing like One Dead, the thing that Françoise was talking about. And every week, people would try to make their most outrageous one, and they'd pass them around, and they'd, amongst themselves, figure out, okay, man, you win, you did the better one. And whichever the best one was became the cover that week. And the others would be the next 12 best or so would become the covers we spared you this week, a page inside. And they were pretty outrageous. Like I remember just when we were in France during the Yugoslavia meltdown, the cover that week was, how can you call it a genocide when they don't have an orchestra? Was one of the covers. And you know, they recently were firebombed a few years ago for their Mohammed issue. They were the only people who really just figured, it's our beat, we've got to do this. And the cover that week was Mohammed with his head in his hands saying, "Why am I worshipped by such assholes?" They literally had their offices bombed out.
But it has something to do also with the French approach of, or using the magazines. I mean, it's a part of the discourse, of the discussion in society. And even when there was, some years ago, there was a bomb going off at the offices, thrown in the offices of Charlie Hebdo, which is now the magazine. And it was even Sarkozy who backed up behind Charlie Hebdo to take care that they could continue the work, even they always made lousy jokes about him.
Yeah, it's a big cultural difference.
Yeah.
And the press has a different kind of status. And it gets a little confusing, of course, to talk about Charlie Hebdo and Charlie, the monthly magazine.
Yeah.
But this was a completely different magazine that was not, political or provocative in the way the Hebdo was necessarily. But this is where your work first appeared in France, right? Am I correct that this is the first
Yeah, that's right.
story that you had published in France?
I started in 1973 to try to more professionalize the Dutch comic artist. I started a book called Cocktail Comics, and cocktail means everything different in it. And I found a publisher, and I could pay the artist for their work they send in for this book. And Willem took a great place of the pages, and then afterwards, the story that I wrote for this book, he invited me to Paris. Can I propose this to Charlie Mensuel? And of course I was in favor, although I didn't like the coloring. The coloring wasn't done by me, that was done by somebody else. It was the first issue. I think they started printing in color, and they didn't have any experience yet in that field, you could easily see.
And Willem, I think, was, who you just mentioned and who was mentioned before, was an important kind of international link. He had a magazine that ran for a few issues called Surprise.
Yes.
And we see that you drew the cover for the first issue. And the second cover is by Kim Deitch, who's probably upstairs right now. You know, an American underground artist being published in France by a Dutch artist who's putting together this international magazine. These are a couple of other issues of Surprise. I was actually just... do you know who drew this #3 cover?
Well, it's a French artist, but I forgot his name. But
That's the only
no.
one I couldn't...
Oh well, probably somebody of the Bazooka group in his early days. Yeah.
But the in the
Olivia?
Huh?
Olivia Cabin?
I don't think so. Olivia was more. Enfin,
Heavier drugs.
but the one on the right is by Ever
Muller, yes.
Later would be Raw, published in the U.S.
but that was a funny thing that within this context of Charlie, many things were possible. I remember the talks often that when the money was almost finished and there was no money to pay the printer anymore, with the last francs that were still there, Professor Choron invited bankers to a fantastic dinner somewhere. And then he discussed at the end of the dinner, after many wines, how can we survive our magazines? And then came again some money. I mean, that was the trick. That's how it worked.
That's brilliant. And around the same time, actually, are some of your work was being published in French publications. Here you're on the cover of a weekly called BD. These are all covers of French comics magazines that don't have your artwork on the cover, but you actually had work in these and more. To what extent were you aware at the time of this French comics?
Oh, by then, totally. This is when I kind of first immersed there.
Okay.
Bayday, the one on the left, was a kind of tabloid, short-lived thing that wanted to be international, and I believe that Jack Tardy's wife was the editor of it for a while. The other ones are interesting magazines. Not that this wasn't in its own way, but Fluid Glacial and L'Echo de Savane, in one form or another, they're still alive now. They were very much inspired by Harvey Kurtzman, very specifically. Fluid Glacial was done by a triumvirate of artists. Claire Bredesher, as some people may know in America, a guy named Mandrika, who's an important cartoonist there, and Gottlieb. Gottlieb, very specifically, was the French Harvey Kurtzman, having really studied it deeply and really built on that with what Super Dupont was one character, his Frenchman. Am I wrong?
No, go ahead. No,
Well,
it's all right.
What were you thinking, Joost?
Well, I was thinking what to say next.
and it was funny.
To me now, yes.
Well, anyway, these were really significant magazines that had the advantage of not being as underground as the underground. A lot of these people were the cartoonists who had worked for the children's magazines, and then saw, wow, you can draw tits. And you can just, it just made everything a lot bigger. And then they began to do magazines for grown-ups, but different from the underground. These people were kind of classically trained cartoonists in a way. French comics weren't as genre well, it wasn't the same genres as America. It wasn't people trained to draw characters on steroids. It was a kind of Tintin, Asterix tradition. And they were able to make comics for an older age group, more sophisticated. And those magazines were quite significant in what they were publishing. Very high quality work, because they didn't have the problem that American comics had of being sold in head shops. In France, there's kind of a right of distribution that sets in. So all of these things were widely disseminated.
Well, and so it feels like there was a lot of stuff happening internationally all at the same time, and I think something that was alluded to before when you were talking about the artists of Tintin and Presentier, something that I think was also happening internationally sort of all at the same time was that the sort of official histories of culture had overlooked the history of comics to a great extent, but you have cartoonists sort of discovering their own sort of patrimony kind of simultaneously, and I feel like in the Netherlands, one important side of this was something that was mentioned before, was the real free press.
Yes, it was. And I think that developments in France and in other European countries were far different from the Netherlands. Netherlands is a small country, and the magazines that were made for an adult public were distributed in small amounts. Like in France, first you had a Tintin magazine, and then came Pilote, and about the same sort of artist published in it. A new generation came, and they transformed the comics dedicated to an adult public, but not yet as free as the American underground. It got all changed. But they were professional artists. Like in Holland, the print runs were so low that you needed to do something aside the work that you did. And the real free press played an important role. There was a small bookshop in Amsterdam, and to me very important, they asked me they are my first publisher, they asked me to do covers for classic things. I made the Upside Downs by Gustav Verbeek, a book that they published. I did also...
And in this case, you're using some of Verbeek's artwork, but you're designing the frame for
designing the frame, because the artwork, I thought this was a very good image for a cover. And I wanted to have it some classical appearance, so I designed the typography in an old handwritten manner. But as you know, the covers that I did for Crazy Cat comics, that was something else. I didn't want to put a page of Crazy Cat on the cover, and I couldn't get hold of an image that would be one strong image for the cover. So I decided to draw my own Crazy Cat. So this is not George Harryman. This is what I did. I sort of ripped off George Harryman, but it was in honor of him, so it's an homage, we say.
You signed it JS, so people
I signed it JS,
in his handwriting.
More or less. Yes, I did. Yeah. And there is one more little joke. There was the brick shop where Ignaz Maus could buy his bricks to throw to Crazy's head. And there is the best brick possible is in the frame, and that's a brick for Michel de Klerk. And everybody who knows, and I think nobody knows, but everybody who knows something about the Amsterdam School of Brick Buildings in Amsterdam, Michel de Klerk was the most important exponent of that group of architects in the 20s.
And kind of coincidentally, you're involved with a publisher who's doing this kind of reprint activity. You're in some cases designing covers, and at the same time they're publishing your contemporary work.
Yeah.
You also were close to and involved with people almost simultaneously in the U.S. who were also kind of reviving some of this historical work. This is a cover that you drew for Bellier Press. This is a collection of...
I think Jeff is in the room, or at least in the building there, right there. Yeah, he wanted to publish the Tijuana Bibles, and it was great to be able to work on that and get to see all of them. I think maybe did they all come out, all three that we did? Didn't sell. It was at a moment where more aggressive pornography could come out. But I did one cover, Bill Griffith did another, Spain Rodriguez did another, and it was the roots of that kind of samizdat publishing that was underground, was sort of in its family tree. Definitely was the Tijuana Bibles, and in general, you know, even when we were doing the Gothic blimp works, all of a sudden there'd be a page by Harrison Cady or other old stuff showing up. I had gotten into the comics universe and learning the old comics a lot through Woody Gelman, who I see the slide right ahead.
And this was a publisher who I think, like Real Free Press, was trying to find ways to package a lot of this historical material.
Yeah, it was, and broader than comics. I mean, his first book was about Charlie Chaplin, but he was an amazing collector of paper ephemera. His house was overrun with it. He would get more than one run. So he'd buy like every issue of Punch magazine when it was a humor magazine, or Life magazine when it was a humor magazine. He'd have one run intact because he was a collector, and then he'd have the equivalent of interns ripping apart every page of 2 copies so they could be filed by artists. And he also rescued the Little Nemo original art from being destroyed.
You need 3 copies.
Yes.
One to file entirely,
And one for each
one
side.
side of the sheet for one artist, and on the other side
Exactly.
another one.
So he was the person who saved Little Nemo, which is now part of the, if anybody has a canon of comics, I can't imagine McKay not being an important part of that. But Woody single-handedly rescued this material. Literally, can I tell the original story, or are you running late?
No, go ahead.
Okay. See, what happened was he was working in an ad agency, doing comics ads that led to inventing Bazooka Joe and eventually to giving me my 20-year stint at a bubblegum company. But he also, when he was working with these other production houses. One of them was a place he had a gig, and all of the tables were covered by Little Nemo originals with coffee cups on them, razor blade marks, because they were used to protect the tabletops from getting scarred. And we said, "My God, those are Little Nemos. Those are by Winsor McKay." He said, "Yeah, he was my dad." But this is like, this stuff's a treasure. It's what made me want to be an artist. And yeah, nobody wants these things. I tried to sell, we tried to revive Little Nemo and do stuff. Nobody's interested in this stuff. He said, "I'm interested. I'll buy them. I'll buy all your originals." I said, "Nah, nobody's interested." And the result was Woody Gelman came in late at night and stole every one of those. It wasn't greed. It wasn't collector's greed.
It was a heroic act of preservation.
It was a heroic act.
Yeah. And you worked for him doing some production kinds of things.
Yeah, but I will not take any credit for the Crazy Cat production. I was appalled by it.
Okay. But you did tell me, if I remember correctly, an anecdote that you did the type.
Oh yes.
On this book.
I did work on this book, even though I'm not a big Alex Raymond fan. But I designed the cover, and of course I made psychedelic lettering for Flash Gordon, because it was the moment. And so it turns out that lettering became, because nobody had a sense of history, became canonized as the official
This is one of the most obscure things that you've ever done into the culture in a bigger way than probably anyone ever anticipated. Just one other thing before sort of getting into this international stuff. I had always assumed that Raw was the first place that Joost's work was published in North America, but looking around a little bit, I saw that there was an underground comic book very, very kind of late, as the door was sort of closing on even like the possibility of underground comics, published by Kitchen Sink Press, called Dutch Treat. Right. And I think this was a compilation of material that had appeared in Tintin.
Exactly.
Here.
Yeah, that's the case. And I think there must be another one too. I'm not sure. But maybe there are 2 different.
We almost published Joost in Arcade. It never quite happened.
How did you see that work? Was it from some of the French magazines that were publishing other international material?
I think that somehow Tintin reached me. That's why I know we were in some kind of contact. I don't know what the doorway was that opened it up into falling into my hands, but
But I remember when you were in Amsterdam and we drank ink, then you mentioned that you would be starting a magazine. And you asked me whether I would like to participate in it, and which I was delighted to. So there was a sort of early start. We should say Raw was the real start.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Joost's work was crucial to Raw magazine in terms of that finding. You know, Raw was
I mean, you have to mention Françoise that.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
Yes, that was an inspiration for Raw.
That's really was
You're right.
the connection is
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I
format.
forgot.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing. There was Bernie Wrightson in it, and Jacques Tardy was
This
in
was
it.
a French publisher, bookshop owner. You know,
Robial.
yeah, Etienne Robial and Florence Sastock, to be non-sexist about it, and they did some amazing publishing of reprint material of contemporary artists. And they invented a format which was 30 centimeters by 40, which was I think even bigger than Raw, devoted to art by Jacques Tardy, by Joost Swarte, and by the bazooka artists who got a brief mention, among many others, some old stuff, some new stuff. And the luxury of that was really important as a guiding principle, because a lot of the stuff in America was always like just newsprint, black and white, and disposable was part of its charm. But it really felt different to see these things on 120-pound stock, beautifully printed and produced. Robial was a great print design, type designer and graphic designer.
It's still
of the magazine.
influential, I think. I think even L'Association sort of got their start doing an anthology at the very end of Futuropolis, and now Robial's working with Jean-Christophe Menu sort of as a kind of guiding force. In
Absolutely.
publishing.
That was significant.
Isn't yours the first account?
I don't think
No,
so.
I don't
Is it?
think so.
No, I don't think so. I thought
Oh, yeah.
there was Bernie Wrightson first, and maybe Jacques Tardy, but I'm
I
not
think
sure.
Tardy was.
But I had the idea to make a more elaborated cover, and in a sort of a mock-up I sent to Etienne, there was all in a color that I like very much, pistachio green, and all one color, and just the name Swarte head of it, and that was it. But a very, very small little drawing of my character, Jopo de Pollo, in the middle. So he feels lost, and he is lost on this cover, but there's nothing around him. And he said, if this is the cover, send me the elements. And I said, well, no, this was just a mock-up. I want to do a more elaborate thing. I want to present myself in Paris. And he said, no, this is fantastic. And so I followed him, and yeah.
And that certainly
Pistachio.
did precede Raw, whatever number of the 30 series. It was an early and important addition. I was going to say that in general, Raw was happening as the underground was beginning to crumble, let's say, after a period of real vital experimentation and wild stuff. It was reducing itself down to, we want sex, we want drugs, you could have some politics, but make it with a lot of cross-hatching so it looks like Crumb did it, okay? And the energy was kind of going out as the head shops began getting busted. That was the main distribution for it. And we wanted to make a new comic because it was a very desultory world in American comics in the late 70s.
I remember this one for Raw #2, the cover that I did initially. I thought I want to surprise the readers by not coloring the image, but coloring the margin at the left. And I spent a lot of time to cut all the zipper-tone dots.
That's a tour de force.
For this motive. And I got a phone from Art, and he said, why shouldn't you color the image? I mean,
We're paying a lot for that color,
yeah. And I said, I invested all my time in the margin, and I don't have any time anymore. I have other obligations at the time. And I said, I'll find someone. And that was Françoise, who colored it all with the zipper-tone.
Françoise did zipper-tone with those little cords are brown, which means 3 different colors having to be placed 1/8 of an inch wide so that they don't create moire patterns. She was an amazing eagle-eyed craftswoman as well as a good colorist. And I know that Chris Ware says that was his graduate school in learning what color should be, was was that cover of that particular raw. The first one where we could afford to fill an entire page with color printing, and Joost just used pale yellow on everything.
And I just very briefly scanned through those images. These were all elaborately hand cut by Françoise. These overlays using adhesive shading film to indicate color density for the cyan, the yellow, and the magenta plates, which has become a lost art. Do you miss it, Françoise? Yeah.
I miss any things that I could do by hand. But I see upstairs you have all those people making their own books and stapling and still alive.
Actually, you know, Joost and I both got really interested in color separation, so that Joost had done this amazing lesson in how to do color separation.
Yeah. This was a lesson by my professor Anton Makassar and his pupil Pierre van Genderen, and he explains how you print colors. That colors is a combination of a certain gray. I mean, you start with gray, say you give it a color with the ink, and if you have a light gray of, let's say, magenta, and you have another light gray, maybe a 30% of yellow, and you combine them, then we have the salmon-like color of a skin, for instance. So I explained in many ways how it could be done.
And I ended up doing this thing called Two-Fisted Painters. There was also, the whole subject matter of the comic was color separating, and as was the subject of the inside covers of Breakdowns. Taking the overlays and then printing them, but labeling the same cover image with the yellow plate labeled blue and the blue plate labeled magenta. Yeah. And so I got this kind of very complicated thing with two separate images that were interweaving with each other and turned upside down sometimes. It was months figuring that damn thing out. But the physicality of the printing was really a part of what Joost and I have been interested in for many decades now.
One of the things about this raw cover, you mentioned actually how Chris Ware has talked about how the color was really influential here. In the introduction to your book, Fantagraphics, he even says that he was a very young man when he saw this, and for a moment he thought it was by the artist of Tintin, Hergé, because that work is very. I think up until certainly Steven Spielberg got a hold of it, it was sort of exotic here in the U.S. I don't know too many people who grew up reading Tintin comics as children. I know some, but they're unusual, they're atypical. They, in many cases, have parents who maybe have traveled a little more widely than the average American.
I don't know too many people who saw the Tintin movie.
Well, that too. but at least many people have seen it on the side of a bus, so there's that. But I'm kind of wondering, this. I think a lot has been made of your connection to Hergé. I think more specifically, there's a broader Franco-Belgian tradition that also connects to McManus and other things too.
Sure. I was grown up with this material as a child, and I loved it very much. Mm-hmm. And then my early underground work is not only that I took the freedom of the American underground artists, I also imitated their style because I thought the style comes close to the freedom of the work, which isn't the case. And at a certain moment I decided I want to make something beautiful that makes me remember or that gives me the same fascinations that I had as a child. And on the other hand, make a story all with all liberty and all freedom that I can get also. So now, in fact, you see here Yopo on the right, which is my comic character, and he has the pants of the golf pants of Tintin, and he has on his a sort of a badge on his jacket, which comes from Crazy Cat. And in fact, as he is a music lover and always tried to make music, he isn't able to. His head is a deformation of a musical note. That is to say, it's a bowl, and there is one stick, and there's a little flag. And what I did, I took the stick out and put the flag right on the head. So, and that's probably something that I learned from from the films of the Marx Brothers. We didn't discuss yet, I mean, I don't think we have the time, but the silent movies were, to me at least, very important because people behaved in a certain manner. I mean, they had gestures that you easily could understand. And so without words, but the gestures are telling something. And I think that has a great influence. And in the films of the Marx Brothers, you see that not only you can recognize them from a distance, but also, I mean, to me they looked alike. But if they have another hat, or a wig, or a moustache drawn on the face, they make really different characters.
Yes,
so
all Jews look alike.
One of the things that's interesting is that I think probably to someone who comes from the Western European country that has this exposure to the Tintin and the Franco-Belgian comics tradition, your work signifies a certain kind of thing because it has some connection to that, perhaps. Certainly this character. In North America, you're publishing this work in Raw, you and Françoise, and the characters are not as well known. I'm also guessing, Art, that you, probably like a lot of Americans who are interested in comics, did not grow up reading Hergé necessarily, but probably did your due diligence at some point and explored the work because it is so important in global
I actually
comics
saw
culture.
it pretty early on.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like, I didn't like it. I just loved the way it looked.
Mm-hmm.
It was about as, it's like reading wallpaper, but the wallpaper's interesting. But I did love the way it looked. And on the other hand, it never really caught on here. It did in England. I think the editions that I saw were actually distributed in America but produced in England. And other versions of Hergé would come in through Children's Digest magazine, taking away the beautiful color and publishing it in pistache and black. But that cover was the 3 tributaries of Raw. It was at that time, the Scream was always a cliche, but maybe not when it was first made, but it became a cliche. But for me, it wasn't it was in the world before they'd made blow up Scream dolls. But that represented the art brat wing of Raw. Little Lulu grown up was the American comics grown up, and this middle-aged fat Tintin falling out of the window was the Euro tradition grown up, all falling out the window.
Another place where you both published work has been The New Yorker, where Françoise is the art editor. And for a long time, Art, you were, I think, pretty strongly identified with The New Yorker because you were a frequent cover artist. Joost, you've done a handful of covers, but a lot of interior illustration for this magazine. How does it feel for you to be a European trying to capture the essence of something that represents a magazine called The New Yorker?
Well, first of all, I had a pile of New Yorkers in my studio, so I started to inform myself. But when I'm asked to do something for the New Yorker, I make the New Yorker sends me the article. I read the article. I try to pick up the essence of what the article says, and then tell the story in my own way. So that's more the way I do it. And then I realize that my point of view is probably different from the point of view of the editors in the New Yorker. So what I do, I see the subject from a variety of angles, and I make about 3 sketches, and we choose from the sketches.
And Art, for you, did you feel connected to the New Yorker when you were a kid living in Queens?
I'd see it at dentist offices. But I had bad teeth, so I saw a lot of issues, and they had like Peter Arno and Charles Adams, and I loved the cartoons in the New Yorker, but the magazine itself wasn't the thing I revered, because by the time I'd be old enough to be a New Yorker reading Sophisticate, it was right in the heart of the 60s, and the New Yorker felt a little stodgy by then, even though I was interested in Saul Steinberg, but the verbal part of it and whatever wasn't really coming from the same place, so I'd be more likely to read Rolling Stone or Esquire or whatever if I was reading a magazine off the stands. I've come to respect it more, but my opportunity at the New Yorker came because it had an editor that respected it no more than I did. It was Tina Brown. And as she was in the middle of turning the magazine upside down, I seemed like a useful part. But I had to go to the things that I did know, like Mad Magazine. So I just figured I was doing Mad covers for grown-ups without Alfred E. Newman in them.
Well, you both produced, you both produced dense, beautiful comics. You've also produced very iconic single images. This is one,
This was the one that launched.
Talked about many times before. Very, early controversial New Yorker cover that sort of put a stamp on that era of the magazine. Joost, you've done some stuff for the New Yorker, but you're a very active illustrator. There's a show up at the Society of Illustrators now with a lot of examples of your illustration. This is an early iconic image of yours, originally from, was it 77?
No, I think it's 74.
74,
Yeah.
okay.
74, 77? I don't know.
And I think this was...
77. You're right, 77.
I think this was this the back cover of your Tonkaron? A little later?
Well, it was in this shape,
Uh-huh.
but I made it. I made it initially for the back cover of a record
I see.
of punk and new wave music
makes sense.
in the Netherlands.
So you could square.
And so it was a square image.
Okay.
And then when Etienne Robial asked me to put it on the back of the 30-40, then I said, it's better to make the image a bit higher. And I had two print runs. There was the black and there was the pistachio. So this is the result. So in fact what you see now is this immense mirror which leaves a sort of an empty idea of what's happening with the man down on the bench and what he is seeing, and you see in the reflection of the mirror he is looking at a lady dancing with another man, and as her the lady's bag is on the table, you can imagine that it was probably his fiancée or something. I don't know, but it's a drawing about jealousy.
It's also just beautiful composition. We're so happy to be able to steal it for raw. We used it right after the most densely packed European cartoonist we've ever published, named Pascal Dury, whose stuff was the opposite. It was just wonderful chaos done in scratchboard and whatever, and then this absolutely rigorously, beautifully designed thing. I'm just surprised to learn only now that you didn't have that vast window from the beginning.
That's right.
I've actually used this image in classes that I've taught, just because it's so astonishing that there's just these little precise pieces of information that really tell you a whole story. And I feel like just as like these little minor details tell you the whole story, the composition as well. I mean, it's almost all empty space, but your brain kind of projects into the mirror, and you create this three-dimensional space in your brain. And then, I have talked my students through the narrative of it the way you just did, and then I look, it's like 30% empty space, or something. It's kind of incredible. And my understanding is that this is sort of like, for a while, kind of like a hip poster to have, right?
Yeah, you always have to guide the eye of the reader. So what's the first thing they're going to look at? And that could have some black in it or something. That the first attraction goes to that specific detail. And then later other details come in. And finally you get the whole story. But you have to direct the eyes of the reader.
I think it's very obvious to talk about the things that are different between making a comic and making a single image. Are there ways for either of you, when you're making a single image, that your background and experience with comics informs the way you might make a single image? Do you make it differently than someone who doesn't have a kind of comics background? That's a very broad question.
I think in both ways, comic artists are a bit different than it's different than fine artists. It's to say that I at least always realize that somebody reads it, and I try to play with the thought of the reader, and also I realize that what I don't tell will probably be filled in by the reader himself. So if you see how many if you would hear how many explanations this drawing had, and all influenced by the variety of readers. That's great fun.
And to me, well, I wouldn't even compare it to fine arts because, comics are serious. The other, fine art is an extension of the stock market and of fashion. And there used to be such a thing as fine art, but that was before I was born. And cartoonists are different from illustrators, which is a different place, and usually given a higher spot. If there's a hierarchy of the arts, at the bottom are tattoo artists, at the top are abstract painters. Somewhere slightly above cartoonists in the intellectual sphere was the single image illustrator and cartoonist, because it had something in common with the notion of figurative painting as the pregnant moment, the one moment that catches everything, as opposed to the multiple images. That's why gag cartoonists, even though they use words, they don't sully the picture with them. It's a single image, and that puts it slightly higher on the aesthetic plane, though not on the economic plane, than the great American comic strip, usually. This is just a basic hierarchy. It's not. But for me, the main thing was, as a cartoonist, it always should tell some kind of story. It's not just a nice picture. There's a narrative implicit in it, and very often there's a way of making it multiple panel, so that the one that you're showing now was exactly that. It was all I was asked to do was a self-portrait for the New York Times when my retrospective was opening, and I was very glad to finally have a small mouse head on rather than just the size of a zit. But it was ultimately both multiple panel and single. And I just saw that you had the poster that I did that Joost introduced me to the animation festival man, who had this avant-garde animation festival. I was asked to do the poster one year, and since it's when you started the question, that was there. It's somehow a multiple panel comic strip built into its one image. And that character is the logo designed by Joost for the festival that I then used to bring animation down to its most rudimentary movements. And in some ways, although I wasn't conscious of much of anything on September 11th, 2001, I would argue now that the black-on-black cover is a two-panel comic strip.
I have it actually.
Yeah, it's at the bottom of the pile there.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, and it is. I think that there is something of a kind of narrative and compositional and structural component that underlies a lot of your single images as well. That's different than what you might get from another artist, as you were discussing.
Well, Françoise is always looking for people who can tell a story. That's just basic to the endeavor of the current New Yorker covers, one of the more primal things.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. I feel like we could talk for another 3 hours, but I do have one thing that I'm obligated to bring up here. Tomorrow, Art and Joost will be showing. One of the things that's really great about both Art and Joost is that they've been doing a lot of collaborations recently, and Art worked with fabricators to produce a stained glass window at the High School of Art and Design. You'll be giving a tour tomorrow at 10:30. This is the poster. We have a couple of I didn't bring too many images because I don't want to. No spoiler alerts.
It's just like that's the basic window. It's 50 feet wide by 8 feet high. It's built two-sidedly, and it has embedded images on the other side that you can't see from the cafeteria, but from only the cafeteria above. I'm inordinately proud of it. I spent 2 years on the damn thing. It's my old high school. The High School of Art and Design was a vocational high school that had cartooning courses. How could I not go? And it's still around in a new place, and I was lucky enough to get or win the commission to do this thing. And I made it as a gift for the students, but I didn't know that the gift would have no visitation rights whatsoever because it's a school.
So tomorrow is one of the only times it's been open to the public.
Cooking to make this happen because it's like the NSA, National Security thing to get into a school building and have an ID to get in. I'm going to leave this flyer here because I really am proud of it. I'd love people to see it. Joost will be talking with slides about his window works.
We can give these to a volunteer at the door who can maybe pass it out.
Just pass it out to anybody who wants one.
Sure.
This is the info. It's arranged as a fundraiser for the high school students, where it's a $15 carbon coffee breakfast with a talk by me and Joost about that work, and me taking you on a guided tour of the very complex wicker work of things that are in it and that are referred to that are elsewhere in the building, and so on and so on.
I think they're sold.
Thank you.
So please join me in thanking Art and Joost for being here tonight.